Chapter 3. Among the bevy of attractions that New York offered early 20th century tourists was the spectacle of the city's breadlines. Helpfully listed in period guidebooks, the breadlines operated between midnight and 1 a.m. when legitimate forms of entertainment had wrapped up for the evening. Viewers who came to the breadlines expecting delinquent behavior left dissatisfied. Patrons of the line seemed to materialize all at once, and from all directions providing opportunity for at least some minor shoving, yet confirmations were rare. Well bundled against the cold, onlookers took careful note of the men's sinking posture, their frayed and insubstantial clothing, and their overall demeanor, catching stray fragments of conversation whenever possible to see what these individuals had to talk about. The action reached its climax when a light flickered on inside the kitchen. The men bolted to attention and the line surged forward. 30 minutes later the crowd had dissipated, some with bread stuffed in their pockets, and the street was empty. What the bread line lacked in more conventional sightseeing appeal, it made up for in sociological interest, part of a larger progressive era commitment to open the shutters on urban poverty. Jacob Riis gave this impulse a rallying cry when the title of his 1893 book, How the Other Half Lives, an illustrated foray into the New York slums and all their manifold wretchedness. On the misery index, however, no population was considered worse off than the men on the bread line, which for inquiring tourists only added to its allure. The terrific humiliation of begging their food was an option for only the most unfortunate, or conversely, the most degenerate characters, and people argued for both. The clash of perspectives was one facet of a much larger conversation about the poor and how they should be treated. Among the upper classes, it was generally assumed that the poor fell into one or two camps, those deserving or undeserving of charity, a distinction that went all the way back to the English poor laws. Among the deserving were widows and orphans, the aged, feeble-minded, and infirm, in other words, victims of bad luck. The undeserving, by contrast, were morally corrupt, naturally inclined to boozing, gambling, and loafing. Disagreement over where to place the breadliners was a point of debate among casual spectators and professional social workers, people trained to make that diagnosis. How they were classified determined how they should be treated, whether they should be fed or sentenced to forced labor. The novelist Theodore Dreiser was a proponent of labor camps, his conclusion after spending time on the breadline during his research for Sister Carrie. The city's first long-standing breadline was attached to the ultra-fashionable Vienna Model Bakery, a cafe on the East 10th Street owned by Louis Fleischmann of the Fleischmann's yeast dynasty. I have to check what date this is. Okay. Founded on the idea that the hungry deserve to eat, no questions asked, Fleischmann's breadline carried on for a good 2 decades, serving as the model for a string of imitators. Administered by administered by evangelical groups like the Salvation Army, the new breadlines were sensibly clustered among the Bowery, close to the men they intended to serve. Already a nesting ground for the unemployed, the Bowery at the start of the 20th century was home to a distinctive urban ecosystem. Relics of the old Bowery, the city's main entertainment street going all the way back to the Civil War, survived in the scattering of theaters, honky-tonks, and dime museums that now catered mainly to tourists. After a midnight visit to the breadline, out-of-towners could repair to one of the Bowery beer saloons, often with a hired police escort to round out the evening. The Bowery's main business, however, was homelessness. Bowery habitués were typically drifters, unencumbered by wives or children. May through November they scoured the countryside, tracking down work as bridge builders, canal diggers, loggers, farmlands, migrating to the Bowery when cold weather hit and jobs dried up. Here, under the shadow of the elevated railroad, they relied on a network of cheap lodging houses, saloons, employment agencies, and 5-cent lunch counters to survive the winter. For a free shave, they paid a visit to one of the Bowery barber colleges. To raise cash, they hawked whatever possessions they could live without at one of the local pawnshops. When their cash ran out, which it inevitably did, the men traded in their 10-cent beds for impoverished shelter in alleyways and stairwells and on park benches under tinted blankets of newspaper. For food they turned to bread lines, receiving midnight portions of dry bread and coffee, which the charities euphemistically referred to as a promenade breakfast. The reason they served it at such an ungodly hour, charity officials explained, was to ensure that all the takers were legitimately destitute, as no one with a bed to sleep in would rouse himself for such meager rewards. While Bowery missions said all men were worthy, the midnight breakfast suggested that worthiness was relative, the meal providing sustenance and punishment in near equal proportions. The Bowery breadlines, up and running between Thanksgiving and Easter to accommodate the winter influx, were catnip for newspapermen, borrowing from the movie maker's toolkit. Reporters used panning shots, close-ups, and the occasional montage to create stories that unfolded like cinematic shorts. A 1908 article on the Bowery mission for the New York Times contains the following set piece. Down through the open door came the army of the poor, to the coffee and the rolls, tramping, tramping, the pallid faces of them, the hands outstretched for the rolls, the trembling lips pressed to the heat of the coffee in the cups, the misshapen hands, the grimy hands, the long, attenuated fingers, the cold blue lips, the wolfish backward look of the wild eyes at the pile of rolls, the fiendish stare of insatiable and unsatisfied hunger. Here were the breadliners at their most menacing, but even more sympathetic portrayals left a similar impression of otherness. Whether born that way or beaten down by circumstance, of some combination of both, the men on the line followed their own code of behavior, spoke in their own dialect, and generally kept to themselves, observing the invisible boundary that isolated the Bowery from the city around it. When the economy stumbled, which it did in the panic of 1907, the breadliners grew to a maximum length. The year the Bowery mission fed more than 2,500 men a night and made headline news until the markets recovered and lines shrank to their normal size. Public interest spiked a second time in 1918 with the sudden drop of production after the year combined with the flood of returning soldiers to cause high unemployment. Both downturns were just two in the long chain of depressions and recessions, periods of inflation and deflation, that the United States had weathered over the decades. In the 1920s, beginning under Calvin Coolidge, the country experienced a 6-year stretch of breakneck economic expansion. Factories were running full tilt and at increased efficiency, churning out a parade of new goods. With the encouragement of an emerging advertising industry, Americans clamored for the latest contraptions, spending freely on everything from electric vacuum cleaners to automobiles. What they couldn't afford outright, they purchased on the installment plan, another of the period's innovations. While consumers swooned, American business aspired to a new scale of operation, the nation's larger concerns swallowing up their junior counterparts to form some of the country's first publicly owned corporations. All appearances suggested that the cycle of boom and bust had run its course. Intoxicated by the new prosperity, Herbert Hoover, who was running for president in 1928, famously announced that America was nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. Unfortunately, Hoover's calculation rested on an oversight. The distribution of America's new wealth was severely lopsided, the overwhelming share flowing directly into the bank accounts of the very rich, leaving the poor with few or no gains at all. Among the excluded were the seasonal workers who wintered on the Bowery. However, by this time the general public had become acclimated to the vagrants, accepting them as permanent figures. Commotions over the bread lines had also died down, operating under cover of night in neighborhoods that most New Yorkers avoided. They were easily ignorable, a luxury that ran out with the end of the decade. Through the spring and summer of 1929, confidence in the limitlessness of America's newfound wealth had taken hold of Wall Street, driving stocks to a stratosphere. Suspended there by sheer faith, stock values needed only a loss of confidence to go plummeting back to earth. The stock market crash, conventionally pinned to October 29, was not in fact a single event, but a series of falls and recoveries that unfolded over a period of weeks. Prices on Wall Street began to coast downward in early September and continued their measured descent until October 19, when volume surged and prices tumbled. Over the next 2 days, Wall Street seemed to steady itself, but on October 23 the semblance of order evaporated, and in the final hour of trading stock prices plummeted, primed by the end of the day slide. Speculators were ready to sell from the minute the market opened the following day. When no buyers materialized, stocks went into freefall. The apprehension of the previous few days now crossed over into outright panic. Like a slow-motion demolition, the collapse resumed on October 29 and shadowed to something like a conclusion a week later on November 4th. After the crash, a fog of war effects settled over the United States, obscuring conditions on the ground so that even the most basic economic facts were in dispute. Statistics acquired a new slipperiness. Government estimates on employment jumped from one extreme to the other depending on who was bearing the news. After several nervous months, in January, President Hoover announced that the employment tide had turned. All the major industries were gathering speed and the jobless were finding work. Certain that the president's numbers were off, Frances Perkins, who was then industrial commissioner of New York, responded that her own analysis, according to her presumably more accurate figures, employment in New York, a bellwether for the rest of the country, was at its lowest level since 1914, the year that record-keeping began. Further confounding the picture, a third set of numbers collected by the New York Board of Trade indicated that the local employment crisis had crested and that a spring bounce back was imminent. But in New York City, a place of the warm weather turnaround, the bread lines made an unscheduled appearance. Jobless workers took up their posts at all old Bowery charities. Only this was exactly this time of year when the bread lines were supposed to be shutting down for the season, so this was odd. It appeared, although no one was too sure, that New York's vagrant population, discouraged by gloomy work prospects out in the countryside, had decided to stay put and spend the summer in town. More unsettling, however, was that the new bread lines were popping up, and in the best neighborhoods a piece of tramp culture had broken free of its natural habitat, now at large in the wider city. The sight of those renegade lines tore down the politicians' chatter like a shard of glass through a silk veil. In March, the city's most elegant retail district, Fifth Avenue shoppers, were startled by a trail of hungry men leading to the Church of the Transfiguration, also known as the Little Church around the corner, on East 29th Street. Like an apparition, the line seemed to grow before their eyes, the number of men doubling every few days until it was a solid wall of humanity, 5 abreast, which wrapped clear around the block. Local merchants, worried about the bread line's effect on shopper morale, were predictably distraught when they complained to the city mayor. Jimmy Walker threatened to arrest the church rector, Dr. Randolph Ray, for creating a public disturbance. Unemployed men biding their time on a Manhattan bread line, New York, 1930. Library of Congress, LC, USW, 33035391CC. Whereas religious institutions were old hands in the breadline business, that spring diverse New Yorkers started their own breadlines, soup kitchens, and food distribution depots. Political clubs, business associations, and fraternal orders, debutantes and socialites, newspaper publishers, veterans and religious groups, and even the occasional crime boss all mobilized, establishing makeshift charities for feeding the hungry. By the start of 1931, the city had 82 standing bread lines, the number misleadingly low, as lines opened and folded every few weeks or even days, bringing the total number deep into the hundreds. Collectively, the lines served roughly 85,000 meals a day, which begged the question if business was on a solid footing, as Hoover maintained, and Americans were fruitfully employed. Who were all these hungry people? Following their turn-of-the-century predecessors, reporters engaged in a kind of breadline semiotics, reading the men's outer shells for signs of their identity. At a time when a man's wardrobe encoded his biography, the sartorial diversity found on the lines was newsworthy in its own right. Men with overcoats, men without, men with dirty sweaters, buttoned close around dirtier necks, men with nothing warmer than a summer suit of cheap cotton stuff. Men with the collars of 2 flannel shirts sticking out, men with nothing but a cotton shirt and a jumper blouse to keep out the cold of yesterday, old men, the usual type of Bowery bum, dopes, rummies, lush drivers, who sidle along with furtive glances, young men with a Scandinavian blondness who weave along as though they still walked the decks of the ships they can't find seamen jobs because the town is flooded with their kind. In that hungry line one finds questioning few walks of every type of worker. There are laborers, carpenters, roofers, bakers, foremen, engineers, toolmakers, railroad workers, waiters, cooks, pantrymen, cigar makers, metal polishers, bricklayers, pipe fitters, garagemen, chauffeurs. There are common laborers, men with trades, and men of the white-collar class, shaved and equipped with clean linen. Those white collars became the story within the story. To observers they stood out for the crowd like doves among pigeons, the people inside them objects of spectral sympathy and irony, as this was precisely what the men were trying to fend off. To prop themselves up, former office workers, humiliated by their sudden reversal, dressed for the breadline in full white-collar regalia, a clean shirt, a respectable suit, and of course a proper hat, a bold haberdashery front, their best insulation against the indignity of joining the line. On a more practical note, the right clothes increased a man's chances of landing a job in the future. Since the jobless spent hours a day shuttling from one employment agency to the next, it was imperative to dress the part of the bookkeeper, engineer, or admin. With so much riding on appearances, men, or more precisely their wives, treated work clothes like family heirlooms. Shirts were laundered, suits were pressed and kept in working order, no buttons missing, hence the unlikely spectacle of breadliners dressed as though on their way to a business lunch. Under no central command, each of the city's breadlines devised its own strategy for feeding the multitudes. Those of limited means put out the call for donations of both cash and in kind. In Greenwich Village, the Sisters of Charity at St. Vincent's Hospital served 3 meals a day with food donated by neighborhood businesses, including bread and crullers from the local Horn and Hardut. Further uptown, in his Sunday sermon, Pastor Adam Clayton Powell pledged 4 months' salary to a basement soup kitchen for his Abyssinian Baptist Church. His topic that morning, the appetite of a hungry God in these hard times. He preached the way to appease a hungry God was to do like his only Son and tend to the needs of the body, filling men's stomachs as well as their souls. The congregation responded by storming the pulpit with pledges and donations of their own. Between Christmas and Easter of that year, the church served 28,500 free meals, sending out 2,125 basket dinners and distributing 1,530 pieces of bread and pastry, each portion duly recorded by the church secretary. Meanwhile, at the high end of the income spectrum, some of the New York's wealthiest citizens funded breadlines by reaching into their personal bank accounts. Marion Spohr was a Park Avenue socialite with an unusual hobby as a psychic artist. Untrained by conventional means, she received tutoring of an original sort, painting under the guidance of spirits. Spohr was also active in charity, though not in the check-writing way typical of her Park Avenue crowd. Instead, twice a week, she was chauffeured to the Bowery, where she set up shop on a quiet corner, handing out free meal tickets redeemable at the YMCA cafeteria just a few blocks away. Spohr's technique for dispensing charity, similar to her painting, made use of her intuitive faculties. One penetrating glance at the figure before her was all she required to determine the extent of his needs, no questions necessary. The average customer received a total of 4 tickets, each worth a nickel, while those she perceived as real hard-luck cases walked away with a long strip of uncounted tickets in their shaking hands. The city's flashiest food charity was sponsored by publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, who enlisted 2 army trucks, loaded them with edible handouts, and parked them in the 2 most conspicuous locations he could find, namely Times Square and Columbus Circle. Day and night. After dark, they were lit with Klieg lights. The Hearst trucks attached a zigzagging line of New Yorkers, often waiting for hours for free sandwiches, donuts, crullers, and coffee. Finally, to maximize their reach, the breadlines entered into partnership with a select group of New York restaurants, cheap lunchrooms patronized almost exclusively by men, where customers could fill up and do it quickly on a 20-cent tab. So at the little church around the corner, roughly 1,000 men a day received meal tickets to Beefsteak John's, an old-time eating house with several outposts on the Bowery. The Salvation Army devised a similar system, handing out tickets to the kind of no-frills restaurants favored by the traditional Bowery crowd. With only a single exception, the proliferation of breadlines during the first winter of the Great Depression was an impoverished response by private charities and individuals to a growing food emergency. The one outlier was the line sponsored by the Municipal Lodging House, an institution dating back to the 19th century that provided homeless New Yorkers with a bed and 2 meals a day. The 1886 law that brought their lodging house into existence stipulated that the content of those meals be plain and wholesome, the two hardest working adjectives in the American culinary history. Plain was no understatement. For its first 25 years, the municipal lodging house fed guests on the regimen of oatmeal, bread, tea, and coffee. After 1900, as the emerging science of nutrition progressed, public charities responsible for feeding both the poor and sick were increasingly indebted to food standards, scientifically determined recommendations for the quantity of food required by the body. In 1917, the New York City Department of Welfare issued its own food standards, or basic quantity food tables, a separate table for each population under its care, drawing heavily on Wilbur O. Atwater's nutritional research. Standards took into account such objective variables as age, sex, occupation, and importantly, food cost. More intangible factors, however, slipped into the calculus. Doctors who worked at city hospitals, for example, were better fed than nurses, who were better fed than the orderlies. The 1917 food standards enlarged the lodging house menu, so it now included a bowl of soup for supper. But even with that addition, in the city's nutritional hierarchy, municipal lodgers were a step under prison inmates, at least deserving of basic nourishment. The expanded menu did little to entice homelessness, who bristled at the various demands imposed by the Muni. Starting with the interrogation administered to all guests upon their arrival, they resented the half-day of obligatory labor, either cleaning the building or chopping wood. That was known as a work test, an attempt to determine if the men were worthy of charity. When they dreaded most, though, were the mandatory baths, an insult to the hobo's sense of independence, and as far as they were concerned, a waste of time and energy. A 1923 headline of the New York Tribune neatly summed up the men's position. Tired hobo's last resort is city's lodging house, for there he has to bathe. Rejected by its intended clientele, the lodging house was chronically short on guests, a state of affairs that persisted throughout the 1920s. The spring of 1930, however, with unemployment climbing and jobless out-of-towners streaming into the city, the 800 lodging house beds were inadequate to serve the growing numbers of homeless. The city responded by opening 2 annexes. Each one would double the capacity of the original. All 3 shelters were under the command of an especially dedicated and talented public servant, a World War I veteran named Joseph Mannix, who moved himself, his wife, and 3 young daughters into the main building on East 25th Street. From there, Mannix directed a kind of clearinghouse for the homeless, providing with a clean bed for the night, along with a broad range of social services. For nourishment, guests received 2 meals a day, breakfast and supper. At lunchtime, Mannix presided over the city's most patronized breadline. The municipal dining room, open to anyone willing to endure the wait, was housed in a converted warehouse on a pier on the East River. The line for the mayor's dining room began to form at 9 in the morning. At 11 it was open for business. The municipal menu rotated between beef and mutton stew, franks and beans, and on Fridays clam chowder, all entrees served with a half-pound of sliced bread. Cooked in 60-gallon vats, the food was served cafeteria-style in pressed aluminum dishware and carried on aluminum trays to the double row of picnic tables that ran down the center of the long dining hall. As each man rose from his spot on the bench, a new one took his place. However they managed to operate, headlines throughout the city adhered to a common culinary vision. The pillars of the breadline kitchen were beef, bread, coffee, and sugar, a throwback diet that ignored the many pronouncements about calories, vitamins, and food groups that had dominated nutritional thinking in the 1920s. Providing well-balanced meals, however, was not in the sights of breadline organizers. Instead, breadlines offered emergency rations, foods that were cheap, filling, familiar, and satisfying, and never meant for long-term consumption. From the start, breadlines were a stopgap measure intended to tide people over until prosperity was restored. Photographs of the breadlines captured the plight of the jobless in a single image. The rivers of hunched men in dark overcoats and battered hats, endlessly reproduced in newspapers and magazines, suggested that the hunger was confined to unemployed men, and the women who were back at home with the kids were managing on their own. In reality, women across urban America, in fact, a quarter of the American workforce, now earned their living outside the home, including in those numbers were the many thousands of country girls who had left the family farm to find jobs as waitresses, store clerks, factory hands, and office workers. However they were employed, the economy unraveled. Women too lost their jobs and at a quicker rate than men. The fact that women were missing from the bread lines was never a reflection of need. Rather, women were barred from the lines by force of social convention. In a sad irony, no one observed this particular convention more faithfully than the people it harmed most directly. Business girls, young, unattached women employed as typists, switchboard operators, bookkeepers, and stenographers, now suddenly jobless, resisted the bread lines no matter how dire their situation. To a woman of the 1930s, the bread lines, like any other charity, carried the stigma of poverty, only here the humiliation was multiplied by the very public nature of the lines. This particular charity, moreover, was created for men, and an especially rough class of men at that. Women had no place at all in a male dining hall, sharing tables with strangers, many with coarse manners and disreputable histories. For a woman to be caught in the breadline milieu was to place her good character in question. To accommodate the woman's sense of propriety, a handful of all-female breadlines were established, but they never gained traction. One of them, a mid-town storefront that called itself the Good Samaritan, served free coffee and sandwiches in a dainty dining room complete with women-sized tables. But despite the ladylike decor and the deliberate use of window curtains for shielding the women from passers-by, would-be customers paced the sidewalk outside the establishment, holding their meal tickets, reluctant to cross the threshold. The single woman who accepted charity confirmed both to herself and to everyone around her that she was truly alone in the world with no man to support her, a stigma that remained in force despite women's new freedoms. As one social worker explained it, there is something about standing at a breadline that makes it seem almost impossible. Women still carry in their minds psychological remnants of the age of protection. To admit publicly that they are totally unprotected is often too bitter to endure. An exception to the rule was women who accepted charity on behalf of their children and used the breadlines as takeout counters, carrying home pails of soup or stew for the family table. The growing number of business girls, on the other hand, preferred to disappear from the public eye and somehow fend for themselves. As the winter of 1930 to 1931 unfolded, the fate of these women became one of the Depression's early puzzles. The left-wing journalist Berdel Lesueur spoke from experience when she wrote a 1932 story on exactly this topic. It is one of the great mysteries of the city, Lesueur began, where women go when they are out of work and hungry. There are not many women in the breadlines, yet there must be as many women out of jobs in cities, and suffering extreme poverty as there are men. What happens to them? Where do they go? I have lived in cities for as many months broke, without help, too timid to get to the breadlines. I've known many women to live like this until they simply faint on the street from privations without saying a word to anyone. For these women, hunger was a surprisingly private affliction. Rather than joining the lines, they banished themselves to shared apartments and boarding houses and stayed put, living on a cracker a day, as long as their rent held out. Stories in the popular press introduced these invisible women to the reading public, and before long, Hollywood versions of unemployed working girls became the new stars of the Depression-era movie houses. In the Busby Berkeley extravaganza, Gold Diggers of 1933, three exceptionally plucky young women, in this case out of work chorus girls, share a single bedroom in a cheap Manhattan apartment. Behind on their rent and with their best clothes and hock, the girls start their day by pilfering a bottle of milk from a neighbor's windowsill, joking that if the wolf actually appeared at their door, they would eat him. Through the winter of 1930 to 1931, the city's private charities continued to run on the highest gear, their expanded activities paid for mainly by the people of New York. Signs of progress, however, were elusive. No amount of charitable help, it appeared, could alleviate a quickly deteriorating situation. In fact, it began to seem that charity was part of the problem, and before the winter was half over, signs of a shift in perspective had started to surface. In January 1931, in a departure from the sympathetic treatment once reserved for the topic, the New York Evening Post ran a four-part story exposing the folly of the breadlines, the city's most valuable form of charity. According to the Post, the problems began with the city's excessive number of breadlines. An open invitation to jobless men from across the United States, the sheer bounty of free food available in New York was turning the great metropolis into a public feeding station. To make matters worse, new arrivals were capable freeloaders quickly leaning in the ins and outs of the local food charities for the purpose of exploiting them. And the bread lines were eminently exploitable, with each line operating at different hours and no record of who received what. It was possible for a man to eat in as many as 8 lines in a single day, his only limitation the capacity of his stomach. In between meals, the men panhandled, dozed, foraged for cigarettes, or applied for a new suit at one of the city's free clothing depots. The one activity they ran from was work, though in fact it was available to them. To help the jobless earn money, a number of breadlines offered short work stints, splitting logs on charity woodlots. Their material needs met, however, the out-of-towners had no use for the woodpile, evidence that they were unworthy of help in the first place. Eleanor Roosevelt, then wife of the president-elect, serves group of women and children in the kitchen of a New York restaurant in 1932. Everett Historical Collection, Alamy stock photo. With uncanny precision, the Post series echoed turn-of-the-century arguments about the consequences of the indiscriminate charity. That the same charges could surface now in the thick of so much adversity showed the tenacity of America's ambivalence towards material relief in general, and food relief in particular. The ambivalence extended to the breadline's harshest critics, the city social workers, welfare professionals with a long-standing aversion to food charity, social workers condemned to the breadlines as relief of the most haphazard and temporary variety, not much different from standing on a street corner and handing out nickels. The people who ran the breadlines, moreover, made no attempt to learn the first thing about the men they were trying to help, or to offer any form of service or counseling. The cause of more harm than good, the breadlines were humiliating and demoralizing and encouraged dependence, depriving able-bodied men of the impulse to fend for themselves. Social workers were adamant. Breadlines were the work of fumbling amateurs and should be abolished entirely, if necessarily by legal enactment. But the breadlines posed another kind of danger as well. The great swirl of publicity that surrounded them, the flurry of newspaper stories, photographs, and newsreels, diverted both attention and dollars away from other forms of relief, including those best suited to families among the Depression's less publicized casualties. The breadlines, it turned out, were a passing aberration that began to fade with the return of warm weather. Before 1931 was over, the city had forced most of them to close, allowing only a handful of the larger charities to continue their work. Likewise, the police department's mendicant squad had redoubled its efforts to clear out of the army of panhandlers who had recently colonized New York, erasing another sign of distress. With the streets restored to order, it was reasonable to imagine that the city was recovering and would soon snap back to its former self. People who made their living working with the power, however, were confronted with evidence to the contrary. The Welfare Council of New York City was formed in 1925 to coordinate and advise the city's numerous charities. These were the boom years, at least for Wall Street, but social workers had already begun to notice creeping unemployment, the consequences of a changing American workplace. The present depression, in their eyes, was really one point along a continuum. By the fall of 1930, however, it was clear to social workers that the economic crises gripping urban America had reached historic dimensions and would be documented now while impressions were still vivid. With that in mind, the Welfare Council compiled an impressionistic view of the winter of 1930 to 1931 in New York City, observations collected from hundreds of social workers visiting nurses distilled into a single volume by Lillian Brent, a social worker and noted historian of her profession. An impressionistic view describes the effects of unemployment on jobless New Yorkers, many of whom had never before turned to charities. Among the new applicants were able-bodied men of skill and good standing in well-paid seasonal occupations, musicians whose chances of employment had been taken away by the sound pictures, skilled cigar makers, for whose skill was no market because of cigarettes and cigarette-making machines, waiters who had become superfluous because of the popularity of cafeterias, piano cabinet makers and polishers, cap makers, jewelers, and others suffering from the changes in taste and fashion. There were young married men from families which had been under the care of social agencies when they were small children, but who had themselves been entirely self-supporting for 10 or 15 years. There were accountants, stock and bond salesmen, high-grade clerical workers, clothing manufacturers, contractors, and others who had been in business for themselves. This diverse collection of individuals made up the ranks of the new poor, whose single most pressing need was sufficient food for the family table. The public nurses and social workers who served the new poor saw at close range how eating habits had deteriorated. People ate whatever they could get. Inferior qualities of food, and less of it. Less milk, loose milk instead of bottled milk. Coffee for children who previously drank milk. Less fruit and vegetables, no eggs, meat once a week or not at all, when the custom had been to have it once a day. In short, a transformation of the abundant variety characteristic of the diet of even poor in New York City into a monotonous fare consisting largely of starches and sugars. For the nurses who contributed to the study, the health consequences of such limited fare were already visible. Inadequate food was responsible for more sickness, longer convalescences, and an all-around lack of vitality, starting with a loss of pep and building to reported cases of physical collapse. Reluctant but growing awareness of malnourished New Yorkers was the cause for experiment and mass feeding that combined private money with the public machinery of city government. In the fall of 1930, standing before an audience of his 37 commissioners, one for each municipal department, Mayor Jimmy Walker announced his plans to help families affected by the Depression. To carry them through the coming winter, Walker would engage the city's various departments to create the Mayor's Committee on Unemployment, a makeshift relief agency that took existing structures of government and repurposed them, supplying families with fuel, clothing, and most important, food. To pay for all that emergency help, the mayor would tap the city's 125,000 municipal workers, asking that they each donate 1% of their monthly salaries to a special emergency fund. For any man in the room who somehow mistook the committee for a form of charity, a word that trailed a long list of negative associations, the mayor offered stern correction. This was not a charity, he told them, but a wholesome example of neighbor helping a neighbor, exactly the kind of relief advocated by President Hoover. The foot soldiers of Walker's experiment were the police. Their first order of business, a citywide canvass of the unemployed. In the final week of October 1930, officers in all 72 of the city's precincts engaged in a door-to-door survey, compiling a master list of families that could no longer provide for themselves. Based on the officers' counts, supplies purchased by the Department of Markets were delivered to precinct station houses by an armada of trucks, courtesy of the Department of Sanitation. Distributions began on a wet November morning with the now familiar sight of food lines, only in this case they led to neighborhood police stations, the city's newest food relief depots. A combination of rain and the long wait was long enough to drive away some of the crowd, but those who persevered were rewarded with a 40-pound quota of groceries, enough food to sustain a family of 4 for a week. The exact contents varied some from one week to the next, but typically included New York City police precincts were used as food distribution depots. 1930 Library of Congress, LC, USC 62115090. £20 potatoes, 2 pounds beans, 2 pounds rice, 2 pounds macaroni, 2 pounds onion, 4 pounds cabbage, 4 pounds turnips, 8 pounds carrots, 2 pounds sugar, 1 pound coffee, 1 pound evaporated milk, 2 pounds canned tomatoes. On Thanksgiving and Christmas, the quotas were supplemented by a holiday fowl, and for Passover, Jewish New Yorkers received a 4-pound ration of matzo. The mayor's weekly distributions were an early example of the Depression's countless emergency diets, temporary strategies for answering the body's basic nutritional needs at the lowest possible cost. Like other emergency diets, it worked according to Atwater's principle of substitution, the idea that one food could be safely swapped out for a cheaper alternative, but only if it delivered the same nourishment or food value. When he looked at a carrot or an onion or a lamb chop, Atwater saw a nutrient delivery system, a kind of edible apparatus for which taste, form, and texture were incidental qualities. Two foods that shared the same nutritional profile were as good as identical and therefore interchangeable, a single cheap food standing in for an entire food group. In substitution, Atwater saw nothing less than a means for improving the lives of American wage earners. The many dissatisfactions of the best beset working class were, according to Atwater, the direct product of uniformed and excessive food spending. Substitution, a science-based approach to food selection, allowed people of limited means to free up money normally spent on groceries for each other, more rewarding through unspecified uses. Among the foods on Atwater's expendable list were eggs, butter, chicken, meat, and fish. Fruits and green vegetables, though commendable as a source of bulk, were likewise unnecessary, their consumption discouraged. Condiments and seasonings, Atwater called them food adjuncts, inflamed the appetite, leading to overconsumption, another form of waste, and were therefore to be avoided. His food budget now appropriately trimmed, the worker was left with unadorned potatoes, cabbage, turnips, dried peas, and assorted cereals, the cheapest available sources of both energy and protein. The New York quotas paid tribute to the sturdy utilitarian foods recommended by Atwater as replacements for more expensive fare. The cooking instructions that came with the quotas were equally Atwater-esque. On the premise that nourishing food should also be plain, the city provided homemakers with instructions to wring the most nutrients from the accompanying ingredients, while ensuring the utmost in culinary simplicity. All vegetables should be thoroughly washed, pared, and cooked in enough salted boiling water to cover. Cook with cover on the pot until tender. Save water that vegetables are cooked in for soup stock. Dried beans are to be soaked in cold water overnight. In the morning, cover with fresh water, heat slowly, and cook until skin will burst. Macaroni, cook in salted boiling water until tender. Drain water, then rinse off with cold water. Vegetable soup. Potatoes, onions, cabbage, turnips, beans, and barley. Stock for soup can be made from the vegetables they are cooked in. Beans, plain or cooked with onions and tomatoes. Macaroni, plain or cooked with onions and tomatoes. Cabbage, carrots, and onions, raw, sliced, or boiled. Turnips, plain, cooked or mashed with potatoes. Homemakers in need of additional guidance could also tune in to daily radio classes on WNYC, the city's radio station, which covered such topics as cooking with leftovers, meat substitutes, and food values in relation to cost. Just weeks into the 1930 school year, teachers across the city began to notice unusual attendance patterns, more children missing from the classroom, and for longer periods than in normal years. As always, if a child skipped more than 3 days of school, the case required review by the Bureau of Attendance, the law enforcement arm of the Board of Education. Following established protocol, attendance officers were sent to the students' homes to check on their whereabouts and, if warranted, to impose the appropriate punishment. When they arrived, however, instead of truants, they found children barred from school by lack of adequate food and clothing. Those officers became the unlikely heroes of a vast benevolent movement in which schools were transformed into emergency assistance centers, organized along the same lines as the grocery distributions. The School Relief Fund was a joint production between city government and the people of New York, in this case the Board of Education employees, whose monthly contributions bankrolled the fund. Those same employees doubled as impromptu relief workers. In their classrooms, teachers kept an eye open for children who looked to be in need of clothing, seemed unusually distracted, or tired too quickly, engaging them in delicate and diplomatic inquiry about conditions at home. Where it seemed that help was called for, the child was reported to one of the city's 340 attendance officers. If a home visit confirmed pressing need, relief was given on the spot, beginning in many cases with a student's feet. Equipped with sizing charts, officers took the children's measurements and returned later with new, properly fitting shoes, a transaction repeated in tens of thousands of households. By the end of December, the school system had purchased and delivered 28,378 pairs of sturdy, durable shoes, calculated to see their possessors through the winter. New shoes, however, were of limited value to children who were too undernourished to concentrate, and more seriously too weak to attend school at all. Feeding those children became the school's next mission. The idea that the city schools were in any way obliged to nourish their students came of age at the turn of the century with the school lunch movement, a cause that merged progressive politics with the building science of nutrition. Convinced that a poor diet was the prime and most fruitful cause of mental dullness and its attendant evils, lunch reformers campaigned to provide impoverished children with the food they needed to learn. New York's first lunch program was launched by concerned citizens and taken over by the Board of Education in 1920 under the direction of the Department of Homemaking. School lunches were cooked in central kitchens in the city's two main tenement districts, one on the Lower East Side under the Williamsburg Bridge, the second in East Harlem, and trucked to nearby schools in insulated containers. By 1930, however, the problem of childhood hunger had overflowed the old tenement neighborhoods, an eventuality for which schools were utterly unprepared. To catch up with the present reality, the Department of Homemaking patched together an expanded lunch program. Wherever needed, homemaking instructors were pressed into service, their classrooms converted into working kitchens staffed by student cooks. Morning classes were used to prepare that day's lunch, while afternoons were devoted to the next day's dessert. In schools that had no kitchens, stoves were installed in basements or gymnasiums. Lunch counters were created from wooden planks supported by old desks, the surfaces covered in brightly colored oilcloth. Emergency menus and recipes were created and disseminated to all of these satellite lunchrooms, each of them patrolled by an experienced teacher of homemaking to ensure uniform standards. Orchestrating this surge of activity was the director of homemaking for the New York school system. Having taught in public schools since 1906, Martha Westfall was clearly a woman of ample experience. Even so, the job was daunting. Each day, she confessed, brings its discouragements and what seem to be insurmountable obstacles, but every morning means a new day, and yesterday's worries are cleared away to make way for fresh ones. Even the weather seems to conspire against the lunches, and when perfectly good rice pudding leaves the kitchen only to sour on the way, and when innocent beans decide to ferment in the humid atmosphere, or when the cook's back is turned and the soup burns, then problems of international importance seem but trifles in comparison with the troubles of those responsible for feeding hundreds of hungry children. To imagine that lives depended on the school kitchen was no delusion of grandeur. For many students, lunch was their only meal of the day. Parents counted on it not only for the sake of the child, but with one meal covered by the lunchroom, More food was left for the rest of the family. Alternately, children saved food from their lunch trays to take home to their parents, brothers, and sisters. Anything transportable was slipped into trouser pockets. Those supervisors also caught one determined boy filling a handkerchief with chocolate pudding. Another was observed scraping the butter from his bread to stash away for his mother. For the record, despite workplace pleasures, Westphal stayed at her post for the duration of the Depression and continued in her job for most of World War II as well. The school lunch diet reflected what experts of the day declared nutritionally essential foods for the children. At the center of the diet, there was milk. As a source of protein for building muscles, minerals for the health of the teeth and bones, vitamins to protect the body from disease, and sugars and fats to give it energy, milk was believed to provide the very best building blocks for construction and upkeep of the human house. Accordingly, Westphal introduced milk into the substance of every meal. Creamed soups, creamed vegetables, puddings, custards, and cocoa were all lunchtime staples, and this was in addition to the half pint of milk served to each child as a beverage. The following is one of Westphal's four rotating menus. Monday: cocoa, tomato puree, succotash, cheese sandwich, fresh or stewed fruit. Tuesday: pea soup without milk, Italian spaghetti with onion and tomato sauce, white rolls buttered, chocolate pudding served with milk. Wednesday: tomato macaroni soup, thickened with farina, baked salmon or creamed Friday salmon, buttered graham roll, rich custard pudding. Thursday: vegetable soup with rice, creamed lima beans, whole wheat bread and butter sandwich. Stewed or fresh fruit or fruit gelatin or fruit salad. Friday: lima bean and barley soup, jam or fish sandwich, whole wheat bread, creamed carrots with peas or creamed cabbage or mashed turnips, vanilla cornstarch pudding, chocolate sauce. To further guarantee adequate milk consumption, a quart per day was the idea, but a pint was acceptable. Milk and crackers were served as snacks at recess. From the start, school lunch was thought to serve a double purpose. It both nourished and enlightened. Accordingly, the school lunchroom was simultaneously a dining facility and a teaching forum, a laboratory from which to disseminate food knowledge. The hugely expanded lunch program, necessitated by the Depression, provided a rare teaching opportunity, and educators seized the moment, impassioned by the belief that the need for that food knowledge had never been greater. In the lunchroom, the menu was its own curriculum, an example of how children were supposed to eat. Its content, however, was reinforced throughout the school day. In English class, children wrote compositions on one or another aspect of nutrition, while for the arts they drew nutrition-inspired posters that were hung on school walls, persistent reminders of cardinal food facts. In music class, nutritional information was expressed in song, an especially effective teaching method, as facts put to music sink deep in minds of children. Alongside fact-based instruction, lunches tutored children in the more subjective realm of taste. In America's most diverse city, a babel of gastronomic traditions, school lunchrooms introduced a common culinary language, in this case the mild, easily digested fare endorsed by home economists. Getting children, particularly immigrant children, to eat it required gentle indoctrination on the part of lunchroom teachers, a task they were fully prepared to take on. Carefully recording each child's nationality, teachers tracked with foods that were willingly consumed and which were rejected. Reluctant eaters received patient encouragement, never reprimands. When introducing new foods, teachers relied on the power of repetition to make the strange seem more familiar. In the most stubborn cases, special measures were taken. Family members were called into the lunchroom to provide added coaxing, or conversely, food was sent home with the child. In the end, efforts to restrain young taste buds were a shining success. As a direct result of school lunches, children of diverse national backgrounds learned to eat and enjoy items like Boston baked beans and cornstarch pudding, foods found in the ordinary American dietary, which initially they had refused to even taste. Unexpectedly, some food preferences cut across ethnic divisions. Regardless of ethnicity, all children seemed to appreciate buttered white bread and canned peaches. Conversely, foods disliked by the majority of students were lettuce and anything cooked in white sauce. If the story of New York's fight against human misery during this depression is ever written, the public school teachers will be found to have contributed one of the finest chapters of it. So began one of many public expressions of gratitude for the guardians of New York school kids. A voice of dissent came from the welfare experts who observed the teachers in action and found them wanting. Their critique laid out in the pages of Brandt's impressionistic view. Because of the inexperience in social work, teachers and principals were solicitous, over solicitous, too enthusiastic, sentimental, overprotective. They did not understand the deeper social aspects. Their methods were haphazard, and they tended to apply themselves to the wrong angle of many situations. I find this interesting because I feel like with this, they did mean well, but I feel like there's this rigidity there where instead of tailoring, I guess though that would have been super expensive though too if they had changed all the food um by student. But I mean, kids are going to be like a lot of the time picky with food. So you can see they really meant well with what they were trying to get the kids to eat, but it just anyway. Solicitous 1 minute. A beat later they were capable of blunt insensitivity, asking by a show of hands which children had a father out of work, and announcing to the class where that parent should go for help. Confirmation of the fact that they were unprepared, however, it just, okay, I have to check, is it? No, it's not close to, okay, I was thinking maybe the battery is low, but it isn't. Yeah, see, that's messed up that they would have called out children that way in front of other kids for what's going on with their family, because that's probably, I would think that would be so humiliating. Confirmation of the fact that they were unprepared, however, was the teacher's inability to effectively size up their welfare clients. In the absence of well honed detective skills, a must for any social worker, school employees fell into the dreaded trap of indiscriminate giving, arbitrarily handing out aid both to people in real need and to those who could manage on their own. As agents of food charity, the police were even more roundly criticized, beginning with the rations they provided. The food itself was not enough for families of larger size. It did not meet the needs of small children or convalescents or pregnant women or nursing mothers. It was not adapted to the food habits of the different nationalities, and among those who relied on it exclusively, it was responsible for multiple cases of gastric disturbance. What's more, the department's very public method of food distribution was inconsiderate and demoralizing, with people standing for hours in the cold and rain in plain sight of their neighbors, with mothers and children forced to lug home 40-pound cartons containing little more than potatoes, a special hardship in rural boroughs where distances were longer. It was a point of fact among social workers that charity presented certain well known psychological risks. The winter of 1930 to 1931 showed that industrious, well adjusted Americans were just as susceptible as anyone else. Humiliation inflicted on jobless New Yorkers by the various improvised charities told the story in a nutshell. A crash course in emergency relief, the winter also convinced social workers of their own inadequacies. The new poor were different from the kinds of people who normally applied to the charities. They therefore required a new approach. Job hunting was its own degrading ordeal, but for people who had always imagined themselves immune to poverty, the decision to go to the charities was a final admission of personal failure. Once the plunge was taken, however, it quickly became a habit, and people who had never imagined themselves reliant on anyone lapsed into a position of dependence. As the winter progressed, social workers came to the uncomfortable realization that they were adding to the psychological wreckage, and that it was time for everyone to try something new. Oh, oh. I feel like I feel like there are certain things that have changed these days. Um, with the way that companies are packaging foods that make me think that they're trying to hide food scarcity, or they're trying to hide like the problems with things right now. I feel like we kind of already are either like going into something like a depression or are already there, but it's being like hidden in a really weird way. Um, like certain ingredients being switched out as well in some foods. I know that um, like my mom was watching a video one day of things about like foods that were historically, it wasn't this, but it was like some other kind of like list of foods that were often prepared um, when times were difficult. And um, my mom recognized like all of it. And she was like, I love sloppy joes. Like she loves sloppy joes. And that's apparently a food that some people prepared as like a poor thing. Um, it probably, I think it would have been my grandma who would have been alive during that time. Yeah, not her, her grandmother. Not grandmother, I didn't mean that. Her mother. Um, of course, she's not alive anymore. Um, I would say pretty much um, like things I feel like, and she's like my grandma and my grandpa, um, even though they ended up moving to this state, they had originally met in a different, also southern state. Um, I have to be careful how I word that. They met in a different southern state initially. Um, and in that southern state, so like some of the foods that I remember her really being adamant about preparing um, might be really more things that are like still southern, but like a different state from the one that I live in. Um, she, I'm almost positive she would cook greens with ham in them. And she would add salt and pepper to everything. Um, she she did the thing of soaking potatoes and then um, basically parboiling them until the skins are soft, and then removing the skins by hand, and um, then boiling them the rest of the way. Um, she did something. Oh, she added cream to her. I think it was cream and cheese. She liked to add cream and cheese, if I'm remembering correctly. If she made chili, like spicy chili beans, she would add cream to it. Um, she did this thing where she would take a hot dog and split it down the middle and put cheese in the hot dog, and then the cheese would melt in the microwave in the hot dog. Um, Trying to think what else. Other things that were like very like uh, her way of doing things. Oh, um, she did this egg salad that was a little bit more deluxe than what I normally see, but it's like she would chop up the boiled eggs and she would add all kinds of stuff to it, like I think onions, pickles. I think she added pimentos. I don't know. Like she just added a bunch of stuff to her egg salad, and she would make egg salad. Um, she she cooked macaroni and cheese a lot. Um, my sister my sister prefers like that kind of macaroni and cheese over like anybody else's. Um, like just like homemade style where it's been made from scratch. Um, I don't mean like the noodles made from scratch. I just mean like I remember my mom saying that she didn't ever know like that there were different varieties of cheese until she was older, because when she was growing up, um, my grandma only ever used this like processed like cheese product called Velveeta. It's not real cheese. It's like basically cheese flavor thing. I think that's like the only cheese that she would use. I think. Anyway, or maybe it was. Maybe she used cheddar and Velveeta. And maybe that was all. And she liked iced tea. Always had iced tea. And she wouldn't get like regular Coca Cola. She would get caffeine free Coca Cola because she couldn't handle caffeine. Even when she would do beans in this way where it was like just kind of like her way of doing it, seasoning it. Anyway, I don't know. I've not thought about that in a while. Um, I mean, she did eat meat. I didn't. I didn't like that she included meat so much and so much stuff. But she did also have a lot of like she did include like a lot of vegetables too. So I'd say she did at least get a lot of different vegetables. A lot of I want to say like mostly greens. And collards maybe. Um, and like there are some foods that my mom actually cannot stand um, because she grew up on it and had it all the time growing up. And so she has like negative memories of foods that she hated as a kid. So she can't stand turnips and she can't stand turnip greens. She doesn't, or she didn't like rutabaga. I think she's fine with rutabaga now, but she didn't like rutabaga. Um, She liked to make this cake that had like a kind of fruit syrup in it that was good. I don't know what it was called, but she would make that sometimes. I think it might have actually had pineapple juice. Mm. And she liked like that kind of like Cool Whip sort of frosting, where it's not like intense cake icing, but like the kind of cake icing where it's like really whipped. And I don't know why she had like this. I don't remember exactly, but I think she added chicken to stuffing, like bits of chicken. Like not just like whereas like some people will just they'll add maybe like chicken flavor, but I think she actually added chicken, like not just the flavor. And I didn't I didn't like when it was like that. But anyway, and my other grandma, she I don't think she lived in the US no, she wouldn't have lived during that time in the US. Um but she brought her her way of cooking. Like she didn't make anything, I don't think, that was like really like American. She does not does, sorry. She did make spaghetti sometimes. Um but I think that's like the only thing I can remember her making that was actually like American food. She always made Japanese food. So like the difference between that grandma and the other grandma is like night and day. But anyway, yeah, but she wasn't um she wasn't living here during that time, I don't think. Because of my dad's. I would guess then, like based on how old my dad is, she probably came here around 1950. Or maybe not 1950. I would say like maybe in the 50s, I guess. To the US. Anyway, chapter 4. The state of Iowa, President Hoover's beloved birthplace, was a land of rich soil, cornfields that stretched to the sky every summer, and fat hogs in every farmyard. In October 1929, Iowans paid only brief attention to the news of the Wall Street crash that was splashed across the front pages. Rumors circulated about which local businessmen in cities like Des Moines had dabbled too much in the market and lost everything, but the general consensus was that the stock market decline might even help Iowa. Business leaders predicted that money had previously gone to Wall Street would now be deposited in local banks and invested in Iowa businesses. Oh, that's another thing. Dry beans. Like, my mom can't stand dry beans because she grew up on dry beans. Split pea soup. So those are other things that she doesn't like because she had it too much growing up. Um, what was I? General consensus was that the stock market decline might even help Iowa. Business leaders predicted that money that had previously gone to Wall Street would now be deposited in local banks and invested in Iowa businesses. Local newspapers ran articles predicting a rosy future for rural America. The sun is always shining on business somewhere. The industrial East is clouded, but the agricultural West seems to be in for a spell of fair weather. It appears that the farmers were very little hurt by the stock market crash. Most of the damage was done in the large cities of the country and the thickly settled industrial areas of the East. As we travel from east to west, we cannot help but notice a more optimistic feeling as we go. To be sure, grain prices slumped with stocks at first, but have since made a good recovery. Total farm incomes for 1929 will be at least as large as in 1928 and may be larger. Unquestionably, as between the various sectors of our population, the farmers are now in the perfect position. The top banker in Muscatine, Iowa, told the Associated Press that the forecast for local farms was more promising than it has been at any time since the slump of 1921, while a Muscatine farmer predicted better profits from the all-important hog industry. Corn is reasonably cheap. The hog crop is short for the coming year, which leads to expectation of higher prices. Present hog prices are above those of a year ago. Like the rest of rural America, Iowa has been mired in an agricultural depression for most of a decade. Prices for corn, logs, wheat, beef, cabbages, and apples couldn't fall much lower and therefore had to go up. That, of course, was incorrect. By early 1930, the prices for all major agricultural commodities, including fruits, grains, vegetables, and livestock, had begun to drop. The cause of this slide was steadily decreasing demand for farm products. In both the United States and overseas markets, the price of corn on the Chicago Commodity Exchange fell from about $1 a bushel in late 1929 to less than a quarter by mid-1932. This should have been good for Iowa's hog farmers because feeding livestock was that much less expensive, but hog prices also dropped by more than 50%. It didn't pay to feed the pigs, let alone take them to the market. Deflation hit nearly every agricultural region in the United States. During the 1920s, farmers had plowed up 1 million acres of virgin western Kansas lands and planted mile after mile of hard winter wheat. Aided by a stretch of abundant rainfall, they increased production every year, earning about $1.25 I didn't mean to read that way. About $1.25 a bushel in 1927. That price had dropped to 63 cents a bushel by 1930, yet Kansas farmers remained optimistic and planted even more wheat. The following spring they enjoyed a record crop, but received only 33 cents a bushel, not enough to cover production costs. The farmers knew in theory that the only way to push up prices was to cut production, but it was difficult to swallow a temporary loss of income when they had invested everything in their land and farm equipment and had no savings to tide them over. Nevertheless, in April 1931, the United States Wheat Growers Union declared a strike. They would neither sell nor plant any wheat until the price reached $1 a bushel. Kansas farmers couldn't imagine how their situation could get even worse. Later that summer, the rain stopped falling, and hot and dusty winds began to blow. The twin problems of deflation and decreasing demand struck not only farmers concentrating on one or two commodities, but even those producing diverse crops. Violet Krall grew up on her family's 20-acre truck farm just outside Milwaukee. Descended from German immigrants, her parents grew vegetables and kept cows, pigs, and a flock of chickens. They sold their vegetables as well as flours, eggs, butter, buttermilk, bacon, and sausages at the downtown Milwaukee wholesale market, where their customers were mostly city grocery stores and restaurants. Then the Depression hit, and suddenly their buyers disappeared. I was 7 or 8 at the time. One of my brothers and I prepared green onions for the market, involving washing all the dirt off the onions and bunching them. That day when my father returned from the market, he first stopped and threw the unsold onions in the manure pile, all he had taken to the market except 2 bunches. I wanted to cry. All that work and no one wanted to buy them. Violet's father decided to drop his stall at the market and build up a truck route, going door to door through Milwaukee's more affluent neighborhoods to sell his produce. His new business kept the family alive, although there were still many days when the farm produced more than customers would buy. The chickens did not know there was a depression and would very often lay more eggs than would meet the needs of the customers and our own, so we ate a lot of eggs. I took my lunch to school and was joined by classmates who lived at a distance too great to allow them to go home for lunch. Once I was beginning to eat my egg salad sandwich. The girl in the seat next to mine said, "You must be rich." I asked her why she said that, and she said that they could not afford eggs. I offered to trade with her peanut butter and jelly sandwich for my egg salad. I thought it was a good trade, since we did not have enough cash to buy peanut butter. What a treat! The market economy's retreat affected different parts of rural America in different ways. In Iowa, corn and hogs were mainstays of the local economy. A steep drop in prices was a grievous blow to nearly every farm family. Near the Nadir in early 1931, a farmer named Arthur Johnson composed a poem called "Tough Going." The price of feed is high. Eggs are sold for naught. But the market seems to take delight, and oleo is being bought. There is a depression going on. It causes furrows in the brow. Wheat and corn are sold as gifts, but that is old news now. The farmer raises twice as much as he did some years ago. The old plow doesn't scour well in being twice as low. The farmer lives a storm-tossed life, like a rowboat in the sea. He's up and down and twirled about, but he still can smile by G. Iowa farmers could smile because they lived in a state blessed by fertile soil, and if they were lucky, they didn't owe money to the bank or a mortgage company. They still had their farms. Most Iowa farm families still live largely as their parents and grandparents had, plowing their fields with horse or ox teams. Their homes lacked electricity, running water, and modern appliances. They relied on corn and hogs for cash income, but they still grew most of what they ate. When the Depression hit, they retreated from the larger economy to their farms and local communities, finding any means of making do. An Iowa woman churning butter in a well-appointed farmhouse kitchen. Russell Lee, photographer, Farm Security Administration Collection Library of Congress, LCDIG, FSA, 8B30017. For most farm families, it was easy to fall back on 19th century cycles of subsistence farming, from the early spring gathering of wild greens to the late autumn hog butchering. As the Depression worsened, however, farmers were also eager to adopt any modern farming techniques that might help them survive. The local farm extension agents, employed by the state's Department of Agriculture, were full of the latest ideas on soil science and increasing yields, but their suggestions were of little value if there was no market for farm products. It was the home extension agents, all of them women and also on the state payroll, who were far more influential in helping farm families survive the economic downturn. Most of these women were trained as home economists, full of information on the science of cooking, sewing, and cleaning, with an emphasis on modern technology, hygiene, and affordability. The home agent assigned to each district would visit farmhouses to pass out pamphlets, give lectures in town, and convene regular meetings of the local homemakers club. The topics at these events were all eminently practical: how to make your own soap, sew children's dresses, weave a rug from old rags, bake Christmas pies, get grease stains out of your husband's Sunday trousers, and so on. At a time when they had little money to buy ingredients at the local store, many women avidly attended discussions on how to produce more food at home. Most Iowa farms already had gardens. Now they were expanded to cover as much ground as the housewife and her children could hoe. To encourage this trend, in late 1931, the United States Department of Agriculture issued a bulletin titled "The Farm Garden," which informed farmers that a well-maintained half-acre garden could supply vegetables with a market value of $100 to $150. The traditional garden crops included corn, potatoes, onions, cabbages, turnips, parsnips, lettuce, cucumbers, and peas. Now the government encouraged farmers to also grow more leafy vegetables such as spinach and chard for their nutritional value. Oh, that's another thing. Like, my mom doesn't like Swiss chard because she got sick of chard growing up. In Iowa's climate zone, farmhouse gardens could produce fresh vegetables for only 5 or 6 months of the year. Luckily, home extension agents were full of ideas on how they could be preserved for the long, cold winters. These included various cellaring methods for potatoes and onions, special pits to hold cabbages, turnips, and beets, and most important, canning. The technology to preserve food in hermetically sealed glass jars or metal containers had been around for more than a century, but it hadn't been widely adopted for home use until the food conservation drive during World War I. Now, at the urging of home extension agents, there was a sudden run on canning jars and lids. In southern Illinois, where farmers were particularly desperate, they hoped to can a bumper fruit crop. In August and September, the peach trees were loaded down with beautiful fruit, and the people were being urged to can as much as possible. But on every hand, one heard the cry, "We have no cans!" From the garden, vegetables were taken into the kitchen, usually during the hottest days of the summer, where the housewife spent days slaving over a red-hot stove to preserve her bounty for the winter. There was no question that this effort was worth it. One Iowa woman wrote to a farm journal, "I'm canning everything in sight. No matter what comes, we're going to eat." Home extension agents were just one source of information on how best to ride out the Depression. Farm women also turned to local newspapers, women's magazines, farm journals, and if they were lucky enough to have electricity, the radio. Although broadcast radio is barely a decade old, its signals already covered a broad swath of rural America. Broadcasters soon discovered that they had a captive audience in the multitudes of farm women who were occupied with daily chores at home while their husbands worked in the fields. Big food manufacturers began to sponsor homemaking shows, usually heavy on recipes and running in the morning hours, the precursor to daytime television. The fictional character of Betty Crocker was invented by one of the flour companies that later became part of General Mills. In 1924, Betty Crocker debuted as the narrator of a radio cooking school show running twice a week at 10:30 a.m. By 1930, it was heard over 43 nationwide. Not to be outdone, in 1926, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Farm Radio Service debuted a 5-day-a-week show called Housekeeper's Chat, hosted by Aunt Sammy, presumably some sort of consort to Uncle Sam. On the show, Aunt Sammy sat at the center of a large, somewhat inept family who regularly came to her with questions on everything from how to prepare a Thanksgiving pie to why children needed sunbaths. In reality, she was a folksy vehicle for the USDA's Bureau of Home Economics to disseminate its expert advice on nutrition, meal planning, cooking, clothing, health, house furnishing, gardening, and other kindred subjects. The 15-minute scripts were prepared in Washington and sent to dozens of stations across the country to be read by each station's own Aunt Sammy in the local accent and with their own embellishments. The formula was an instant success. The first 4 months of the show generated 25,000 letters from homemakers seeking advice, many of whose letters asked for cooking advice. So in 1927, the Bureau of Home Economics published its first edition of Aunt Sammy's Radio Recipes, given free to anyone who requested a copy. By 1931, the show was a regular feature on well over 100 stations nationwide. Keep saying it wrong. And many thousands of copies of the cookbook have been distributed primarily to the show's rural listeners. Like most home economics, the experts behind Housekeeper's Chat believed in the importance of simple, nutritious, and inexpensive dishes. As conditions in rural America deteriorated, they increased the emphasis on preparing budget meals. A December 1931 show entitled An Inexpensive Christmas Menu began. A less expensive dinner for a thrifty Christmas can be just as good and just as Christmassy as one planned with all the frills and expensive items of food. Its recipes included baked ham and, in lieu of a traditional plum pudding, a chocolate gelatin made with raisins, dates, nuts, and currants. A show titled Low-Cost Meals focused on the many people who needed help planning well-balanced, healthful diets for families with limited incomes. After pointing out the dangers of the staple meat, potato pie, and pancake rural diet, Aunt Sammy turned to the Bureau's experts for a meal plan based on the latest nutritional science. They suggest that when there is little money to spend for food, the diet should be built around the grain products and milk, with enough vegetables and fruits to supply the necessary additional vitamins and minerals. Lean meat, fish, poultry, and eggs, which are more expensive, should be used sparingly. The fruits and vegetables should be those that are in season and, where possible, less expensive in price. Tomatoes, cabbage, carrots, and onions are all inexpensive vegetables as well, worth using frequently for family meals. The menu for the show included shredding string beans cooked with leftover pork, potato salad, stewed prunes, and apricots for dessert, and oatmeal cookies. During long rural winters, Aunt Sammy also suggested that women grow parsley plants on kitchen windowsills and use the leaves to brighten up their dishes and help their families avoid seasonal vitamin deficiencies, while housewives, particularly in the Midwest, avidly joined extension clubs and consumed home economics information. Their husbands found their own informal ways to keep their farms afloat. Although they and their entire communities were cash poor, they still grew crops that someone else might want. From the most isolated rural farms to suburban truck gardens, Depression-era farmers rediscovered the barter economy that had sustained their frontier ancestors. If a farmer needed, say, barn repairs or house painting, he might offer a carpenter or a painter a bushel of potatoes or a pair of chickens for the work. The most popular center for the new barter economy was the country store. One store owner in the tiny, impoverished town of Prosperity, Arkansas, told a journalist, "At least a third of my business is done in barter. I take herbs, hides, poultry, eggs, cream, and butter. sometimes strawberries, potatoes, fruit, and corn in exchange for store goods. In return, the farmer could purchase tobacco, sugar, coffee, soda crackers, wheat flour, canned goods, cooking utensils, and a wide variety of non-food wares. Although some farmers resisted, bartering quickly became a way of life. Swapping gets in a person's blood after staying in the country a while. One day I told Buddy to take some eggs to the store and swap them for some salt, coffee, and sugar. That nearly killed him. He was ashamed to let the storekeeper know we didn't have the money to buy what he needed. I explained how thankful he ought to be that we had something to swap. Even after all I said, he went away resentful, talking to the mule and hoping he'd fall and make him break every one of the eggs. Just to show he'd changed, 6 months later he'd swap eggs for anything, even a ticket to a picture show. In the wheat-growing region of the western Kansas, farmers were broke, but store owners in nearby towns agreed to take wheat for their goods in lieu of cash, even at restaurants. After paying for his meal in a cafe, a local landowner capped the climax by tipping the waitress in Maryland bushel of wheat. His meal cost him 2 bushels of wheat and 2 of oats. He had just completed threshing both crops, with wheat at 25 cents a bushel and oats at 17.5. Another landowner of K Country, while threshing his wheat, took 7 employees to town for luncheon, which cost him 50 cents a man, or a total of 15 bushels of wheat. Unfortunately, not everyone had enough crops for barter. In order to supplement what they had grown, they picked up sacks and went into nearby woods and fields to forage for wild foods. Sometimes these expeditions took foragers across property lines that had been largely ignored before the Depression. When Rowena May Pope was a child in northeastern Missouri, she and her siblings used to explore along railroad tracks and around pastures looking for gooseberries. One day after we had tramped for hours, picking the sour little berries in our muslin flour sacks were nearly filled, we were surprised by a man carrying a rifle. He shouted, "Lay down those berries and get out of here." We couldn't believe our eyes. We knew that man. He was the father of one of our school friends. We responded, "You're only joking, right?" "No, I'm not joking," he answered firmly. We realized he was serious, so we put down our bags and trudged home. Only the property owner and his family would enjoy gooseberry cobbler that evening. In fact, the economic crisis greatly increased tensions, both social and personal, across Iowa and the rest of rural America. The rate of farm foreclosures skyrocketed, and with it rose the number of suicides and murders. To make ends meet, some Iowans turned to moonshining and running bootleg liquor or outright criminality. Teams of robbers ransacked small town banks that had managed to ride out the downturn and raided farmhouses whose owners were rumored to have secret hoards of money. Nearly every farmer faced the problem of thievery. At night, or when families were in church on Sunday morning, thieves would steal milk off their porches, take whole hams hanging from the timbers of their smokehouses, and most commonly and of all, raid the chicken house. John Johnson, whose spread was outside Moravia, Iowa, was one of the many farmers who slept with a shotgun beside themselves, ready to leap up and start blasting at the sound of irregular clucking in the barnyard. It all happened something like this. Miss Johnson was sleeping on a porch at the rear of the house. About 1:30, she was aroused by a peculiar noise from the direction of the chicken house. Getting up, she went to the door in time to see a man round the corner of the chicken house and go inside. She immediately called Mr. Johnson, who, as soon as aroused, grabbed a shotgun and started for the chicken house. However, Mr. Thief evidently became alarmed and lost no time in leaving that vicinity. Mr. Johnson fired several times in the direction in which the thief was traveling, but does not know whether or not he scored a hit. The thief was never caught, escaping with 30 of the Johnsons' finest spring chickens. He was lucky. Many chicken thieves were wounded or even killed while attempting to steal the birds. As the barnyard crime wave rose, Farmers urged crackdown. Of all the thieves, the one most despised is the fellow who steals chickens. The expression "as low down as a chicken thief" carries with it the limit in condemnation, and no man who has the least atom of self-respect will ever be guilty of such conduct as to merit the term chicken thief being applied to him. However, the stealing of poultry is growing to be a major industry, and until courts, especially juries, realize that the chicken thief must be rated as a major thief, and the stealing of chickens will continue. However, no law could stop the desperation that drove people to crime. I'm sorry. It's, I don't know why, just sleepiness. Um, so they were, I'm sorry. I should not be tired right now. I really don't understand. So thievery remained part of rural life throughout the Depression era. For those who, through a combination of bad luck and the dire economy, had lost their farms and jobs, there was little government safety net in Iowa or other rural regions of the country. All that most counties offered was a poor farm. This was a facility, usually just outside the country seat, where paupers were housed in a farmhouse, usually a rambling old wood-frame structure that was sustained by a large garden and a few cows, chickens, and hogs. The poor farm was reserved for designated paupers who were defined as deserving poor who couldn't work and had no family to support them, usually the aged, handicapped, and mentally ill. Traditionally and by design, there is great shame in going on the country. A popular poem called "Over the Hill to the Poorhouse" recounts the humiliation of a widow who is rejected by her children, one of whom sends her to the poorhouse. So they have shirked and slighted me, and shifted me about, so they have well nigh soured me, and wore my old heart out. But still I borne up pretty well, and wasn't much put down, till Charlie went to the poor master, and put me on the town. Over the hill to the poorhouse, my child and dear, goodbye. Many a night I've watched you when only God was nigh, and God'll judge between us. But I will always pray that you shall never suffer the half that I do today. The quality of poor houses varied from country to country. The supervisors were nearly always untrained, and budgets ranged from reasonable to bare bones. In some, residents lived relatively comfortable lives, while in others they were half-starved. The supervisor's salary and budget for house upkeep came out of the same pot. Some unscrupulous operators discovered that the less they fed their charges, the more they could put into their own pockets. When the Depression hit, this antiquated system quickly became under strain. As 1930 stretched into 1931, many able-bodied Iowans lost their farms and jobs and were unable to find work. The existing poor farm system was ill-equipped to deal with this crisis. Poor farms were not meant to house able-bodied men and families with small children, and their supervisors had no idea how to feed the rapidly growing numbers of newly poor. Counties tried a variety of methods to cope, usually a combination of direct relief, giving food, fuel, and so on, and work relief. In Bremer County, Iowa, the Board of Supervisors reviewed every case and tried to put the men to work on town repair projects. If that wasn't possible, the needy were given scrip or vouchers to spend on food and other supplies at local stores. However, the rising number of jobless families quickly depleted the relief budget. In September 1930, Butler County had $10,000 in its relief fund. A year later, it was $7,000 in debt. This work was supposed to be paid for by local taxes, but taxpayers were also feeling their own strains and beginning to resent those who received a free ride on their dollar. The Algona County Board of Supervisors, swamped with so many needy they couldn't investigate them all, decided to publish their names in order to stem a tide of applications which has put the poor fund in the red and threatens to send it to new low depths. In Sioux County, where the names were still kept secret but everybody knew everybody else's business, a newspaper columnist opposed to handouts of food and money did his own investigation of the relief rolls. He finds many among them that are well posted on sports and the frills of life, but leave the job of making a living to the taxpayers, fellows who perform gracefully behind the steering wheel, and have burned, and still burn the gas of joy to excess. He finds all the ex-bootlegger, or the one still feebly functioning, and who refused honest labor when it was offered at every hand. One refused to work for $2.25 per day, and bragged about it. One able-bodied young fellow was one of the first to have his car licensed. Another, not long from the land of the Dakotas, told his landlady to go to H when she asked for the house rent. The county is paying for it now. In the name of the taxpayer, he hoped that these tax eaters would take advantage of the coming corn-husking season and sally forth the fields at wages corresponding to the price of corn. He did not, however, mention whether he found any of the deserving poor on the rolls. In response to the outcry caused by this column, the board made all relief applicants fill out a detailed form with questions like, do you own a radio? Do you own a car? Do you spend any money for movies and entertainment? Do you plant a garden? How many bushels of potatoes do you have? The board gave aid in the form of scrip, which now could only be used to purchase the necessities of life at local stores: flour, potatoes, navy beans, cornmeal, oatmeal, coffee, tea, sugar, rice, yeast, cakes, baking soda, pepper, matches, butter, lard, canned milk, laundry soap, prunes, syrup, tomatoes, canned peas, salmon, salt, vinegar, eggs, kerosene. No one knew how long that aid would last because the Country Poor Fund had already spent $45,000 and was deeply in debt. Worse, farmers had reaped another bumper corn crop, keeping the prices low of not only corn but hogs. For the coming year, Iowa agricultural experts' best advice to farmers was neither to expand nor contract production, but just sit tight and hope for an economic upswing. I think I actually do need to sleep, even though this is strange. I don't know why I feel this sleepy. Thank you. Thank you for watching. I think I really do need to go to bed. I'll read some more sometime soon. I'm just getting so sleepy. So I'm just going to stop here. But I appreciate you listening so far. Good night.